right, let's get back home because there's plenty happening on the news front here as well. I want to bring in our panel. Sid Maher is news director at The Australian, and also Rebecca Wiesner, guest editor at Spectator magazine Australia. Rebecca, Sid, thank you very much for your time.
Chris.
All right, there's plenty more that we need to dive into locally. Applause has erupted in the New South Wales Parliament as politicians held a final vote to officially decriminalise abortion. There were no objections as the lower house ended what was a farcical process. The New South Wales Premier was at risk at one stage of losing her slim majority over the issue. One of the rebel MPs, Liberal Tanya Davies, praised the outcome.
We have achieved a better bill. We certainly have achieved concessions around sex selection abortions, babies born alive, doctors' conscientious objection, as well as continuing the common law provisions around late-term abortions. They were the four main key issues that were of gravest concern.
Rebecca, yes, all ended well, but the path to ending well was long, it was drawn out, and it was really amateur hour, wasn't it?
Well, funnily enough, I actually think part of the problem was that not enough time was allocated to really just work through this in the way that both Queensland and Victoria did.
Yeah.
So there was an attempt to kind of rush it through with hardly any discussion at all, and I think that was the big mistake. I think also we've only just had an election in New South Wales, and a lot of people felt that this was not what they expected from this government. They were very surprised. This was an initiative of Alex Greenwich, and this was not what a lot of quiet Australians thought they were voting for in New South Wales. Nonetheless, I think despite all of the mishaps along the way, we seem to have come out with a bill that everybody can get behind.
I think you're right. Sid, I described the passage of this as arrogant and ignorant, especially in the initial stages. What lessons can politicians right across the country take from the abortion bill that was debated eventually in New South Wales?
Well, I think the first thing, Chris, is maybe people need to start giving the public what they vote for. As Rebecca says, it didn't really come up in the election campaign, and it was a bit of a shock when it finally went ahead. So I think this will be, I'd make a prediction, I reckon this will be the last private members bill that gets up in the New South Wales Parliament in this term.
Although Mark Latham's coming up with a private members bill over religious freedom.
That is true. Yeah, I hadn't considered that, and maybe Latham's got an argument given that Greenwich has got his through.
But the difference will be, and I think they've already learnt from it, Mark Latham has at least, because he's saying that this may even take 9, 10, 11 months to get through, yes, because he's giving everyone what they didn't get through the abortion debate.
That's right. That's right. A chance to put their view. Although, yeah, I mean, I suppose the Premier's come out of it okay in the end. She keeps Davis and Connolly in the camp, in the tent after a torturous sort of debate getting these amendments done. But yeah, I think there's definitely some lessons in terms of consultation and giving all sides a bit of a say. Yeah,
a few people lost a bit of bark over this one. Now, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said that Australia had nothing to apologise for over climate change as he defended the nation's climate record at the United Nations General Assembly. Have a look at this.
Australia's internal, though, and global critics on climate change willingly overlook or perhaps ignore our achievements, as the facts simply don't fit the narrative they wish to project about our contribution. Australia is responsible for just 1.3% of global emissions. Australia is doing our bit on climate change, and we reject any suggestion to the contrary.
Rebecca, I'm glad he had the opportunity to lay down a few facts in terms of Australia, because as people become more passionate, more scared, as we know, when it comes to at least school kids, they lose sight of the facts of the matter and what countries are actually doing to try and help the rest of the world get to an end point where we don't have to be scared about this. And I'm just so glad he did it, but he didn't have to do it, because the truth of the fact is that we are doing our bit as laid down by the Paris Agreement. Now, whether that's not enough, well, that's not solely Australia's problem.
Well, I think there's an awful lot of hypocrisy around this issue. And we see the Europeans, for example, they say, oh, we burn biomass. By that they mean these sort of wood pellets. They call that somehow that's acceptable, and yet the greenhouse gas emissions are much higher.
Correct.
You know, it's kind of crazy stuff. So people are just trying to sort of pretend that they're doing things. We've had New Zealand earlier this year lecturing us, whereas we've cut our emissions much more than New Zealand has.
And New Zealand and Fiji praising China, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's just cloud cuckoo land. One of the great things I think that came out of this visit of Scott Morrison to the US is that both our Prime Minister and the President of the United States are now talking about China having to start behaving like a newly developed country. And that means taking responsibility for its emissions, because China has just been given a leave pass to emit as much as it wants until at least 2030, and yet it's the largest emitter in the world.
Sid Maher, I know we're infatuated with moving towards reducing our emissions, but until China and India do the same, and forget about the fact that they are allegedly developing countries, until they do the same, and until we start putting money into research and development, as Bjorn Lomborg wrote in your newspaper on Saturday, we are still going to have this argument about not reaching the targets we need to reach.
Yes. Now, I think one of the facts that I think needs to be remembered in this debate is Australia produces 1.3% of global emissions. And China is the biggest emitter in the world. You know, India is a growing emitter, and unless something is done to address Chinese emissions in particular, no real progress I don't think is going to be made. I think it was important though for the Prime Minister to make Australia's case on the world stage, both internationally and domestically, because Australia is meeting its targets. It will meet the Kyoto target, and that's not the case for some of the countries that grandstand on the issue. And I think the other thing is the Prime Minister needs to make a case for those sort of more moderate members of his own base and some of those inner city seats like Higgins and Kooyong and some of the inner city seats in Sydney, that in fact the government does have a policy on climate change. The government is committed to reducing emissions, and I think this is lost in some of the increasing hysteria around the issue.
Yes, exactly. The more hysteria, the less concentration is given to the facts of the matter, whether it be the facts on climate change, as we've been told by the IPCC, or the facts in reference to countries like Australia. I think you're entirely correct. Now,
Chris, I was just going to say too, look, one of the things that doesn't get a lot of, doesn't seem to get a lot of coverage on this issue from the left, if I can put it that way, is the fact that Australia has enormous investment in renewable energy. In spite of the fact that there's the argument around coal-fired power, Australia is doing better than almost any other country in the world on investment in renewable energy. So people can't have their sort of cake and eat it too. We've got this. This is a real fact. And I don't believe the government gets any credit for that.
Yeah, well said. I'm glad you said that. Now, something different. The Catholic Church in Victoria is facing at least 800 new legal actions for child sexual abuse after legislation was introduced allowing victims to sue the church and revisit unfair in-house settlements. Now, some of the claims include allegations that church figures ignored or covered up abuse by priests. I think when we're looking at this subject, Rebecca, I think we've got to work out that the Cardinal Pell case has probably opened the sluice gates as well, in that it seems as if we've had one major successful prosecution of the highest Catholic in the land, and that must have buoyed the hopes of so many past victims.
I suppose so. I mean, I think that Something that troubles me is the level of evidence that is actually needed, seemingly. Certainly when I look at Cardinal Pell, I find it deeply disturbing that you have we had 3 people who were witnesses to an event, and one said something had happened, one said nothing had happened, and a third person who said nothing had happened passed away. When that person passed away, the person who said something had happened took the opportunity to put their case forward, almost as if they no longer had the contrary witness.
OK, but we have moved on from there.
Okay,
I know the High Court hasn't moved on from there, but in terms of where we are at, these victims are obviously being buoyed by what's happening in the courts of Australia.
Well, I think that's right. But I still have trouble with this as well. When we say that these were unfair settlements, our whole notion about how we deal with this has changed, certainly over my lifetime, and I've seen that and lived that. There was child abuse at the school that I went to, and the way we talked about it as kids, it's been brought forward, it's been written up in the newspapers. That was a state school. These were not, nothing to do with the Catholic Church. The way it was handled then, the way it's handled now, the way it's been handled in between, the way people responded when Roman Polanski anally raped a 13-year-old girl, we've all changed how we respond to these things. So reopening it, I don't know. I mean, I find this troubling in a way because we're talking about 800 historical cases. Child abuse is also going on every day, most of it not in the church, most of it in the family home. And I really think we've also got to face what's going on now and make sure we don't spend all our energy on 800 priests in the past.
Yeah, I want to get back to the environment for a second for you, Sid. The New South Wales government is close to announcing a plan to double the capacity of Sydney's desalination plant in order to counter droughts affecting the state. Now, the problem with all of this is the amount of power that needs to go in to rev up the desalination plants in all our states is immense. So in one way, we're not doing so flash for the environment if you're trying to cut down on CO2. But on the other hand, gee, we've got to turn our attention to building dams and allowing storage that in drought times is so valuable to us.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, Chris. I think this drought has brought home, I think it's a terrible lack of planning, I think, on successive governments going back decades, that we can be in this situation where towns, you know, are on the brink of running out of water. Now, I mean, we've increased our population, particularly in the urban areas, significantly over the last couple of decades, and we haven't built any dams. And I mean, I think full credit to John Barilaro, you know, trying to get this going. And I think, given the crisis, hopefully it will actually get something moving in some of these places and provide some water. But I mean, the desalination plant, well, it probably does have to be doubled, but it's, you know, environmentally, it uses, as you said, it uses incredible amounts of power, and I think it's really a least best solution. I think, you know, some of these regional towns actually need proper storage, and it needs to be sorted immediately.
Yeah, places like Wyangla Dam in the southwest or central west is actually needs greater capacity so that when it does fill, you're actually able to service that part of the country. And unfortunately, we haven't taken the opportunity when we could have. And, you know, it's only when an evolution comes around that there becomes a little bit of a revolution and maybe we can get some things done. Rebecca, this is a crisis. This is as important, if not more important, than what we do about climate change.
Well, look, I mean, one thing that strikes me is that it's not just a problem for our planners, because we had, for example, in New South Wales, discussion. I mean, we had Michael Costa saying he wanted to raise the dam wall for the Warragamba Dam going back more than a decade. We have environmentalists saying, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that. Every time you want it, we've had dams where we've tried to build a dam and lo and behold, there's been a slug or a
frog,
bird or a frog or
a
who
finch.
knows what. You know, so we can never build a dam anywhere. And really, do we really need to double the desal plants? The last time I looked, I thought we hadn't even turned any of them on yet. They're all rusting away. And Because so I am very suspicious because people make a lot of money out of building desal plants, and I just wonder whether these are the people who are sprouting the need to double them.
In New South Wales' case, $6 billion worth.